So, I'm a huge fan of fantasy and adventure stories, and when you've been reading, watching, and in my case, writing fantasy and adventure stories for a long time, you'll become very familiar with the different types of powers and abilities and magic that exist within these worlds and these stories. And there are many staples in fantasy and adventure stories, but one that seems to always be there, but is the least memorable, I might argue, for many people, is plant based characters or plant based people. You know what I'm talking about. These are the characters that use plants as their like core magic or core power. This video kind of talks and explores that type of character that uses plants, and the ability that they have and what that kind of represents in the larger zeitgeist of our culture. This is just the start of a conversation. I'll likely pick this conversation up later in my academic or YouTube career, or hope to inspire other people to chime more into this conversation, but this video is just exploring these types of characters. Before I can really even dive into the reality surrounding plant-based characters and plant-based magic, as I'm calling them in this video, obviously as a reference to like plant-based food, I thought it was funny. It's important to understand how media presents magic systems in general. First, I think it's important to talk about speculative fiction. Speculative fiction is a genre, well, more like a category of story that contains several genres. But anyway, speculative fiction are stories that use speculation as its main driving force. By that I mean it speculates on what could be, what has been, what might be, what can be, what is, what isn't, and so on and so forth. It fundamentally asks the questions, what is possible and what is impossible. Speculative fiction usually includes fantasy, sci-fi, horror, historical retellings, dystopian fiction, adventure stories, and many, many other genres, because each of those genres have subgenres and so on and so forth. And genres are complex and beautiful in several different ways, and there are lots of conversations around genres and what a genre really is and so on and so forth, but for this video, I'm not going to cover all of that. That's a video for a different day. But fantasy is the main genre kind of referenced in this video because fantasy has magic, and to be a plant-based magic user, you're likely going to be in a fantasy story. I would define fantasy to be a genre of media that contains some form of magic or is defined by magic as its central like focal point. Even if it doesn't have much magic, if it has a little bit of magic, it's usually fantasy. And this definition is kind of rough, but it'll work for the purpose of this video. When I do another video on genre, I'll go into the nuances of fantasy versus like magical realism, which is a different genre of speculative fiction that also contains magic, but not in the same way that fantasy contains magic. Magic can take different forms, like that of the Force in Star Wars, spells in Lord of the Rings, devil fruits in One Piece, or just superpowers in comic books. Magic as a concept is what helps define fantasy against its counterpart. Usually, there's some weirdness with that, such as like horror and science fiction often use things that I would definitely consider to be magic or magic adjacent, but they usually try to explain it away. Like fantasy doesn't try to explain away magic, but sci-fi and horror usually do. Like sci-fi usually tries to explain away what is essentially magic with some type of nonsensical fake science, and horror tries to explain away magic by usually like some type of religious or spiritual explanation of something, which is kind of like magic also. But to best understand science fiction and fantasy and horror, but specifically fantasy for this video, you need to define magic. And magic is defined as, well, I'm not really sure how to define magic. So this video kind of shows me, and likely you, a fundamental flaw in my ability to analyze media and philosophy and much more, in the sense that I can't define what magic is. And genres aren't really clear enough for me to be able to define what magic is, to define what fantasy fully is. And obviously this is kind of clear, as you notice I mentioned the Force from Star Wars earlier and said it was an example of magic and fantasy. Well, Star Wars is not just fantasy, it's also obviously science fiction. I mean, there's spaceships and stuff, so it's considered sci-fi fantasy. But that shows that genres are kind of messy, and I already knew that genres were very messy. I mean, I study English and philosophy. You know, you enter those fields and immediately know that genres are complicated. However, the messy nature of genre itself kind of causes magic as a concept to be complex. And by that I mean the concept of magic is different depending on the story. So sometimes it's space wizards wielding psychic powers and lightsabers, other times it's pirates eating magical fruits that give them random powers, and other times it's ritualistic cultic-like societies doing massive rituals to summon evil things and evil beings and do evil things. Magic's nature shifts from story to story, and there is obviously an underlying concept underneath all the stories, but it's hard to define. And magic in real life kind of follows these same principles. And for those confused, have you ever talked to like pagans or spiritualists or mystics? These are usually people who believe in magic in our world. They usually are consider themselves witches or shamans or something along those lines, or in case of astrology and tarot, diviners. Each of them will likely believe in magic, but each of them will define magic in vastly different ways. And even to a larger matter, like the religious, the spiritual, the mystical, and the atheist will all define magic in vastly different ways. So like, think about this, like a Wiccan or a pagan may argue that magic is real and magic is usable. But the Christian may scoff at that idea, and I'm a Christian, but the Christian may scoff at the idea of magic, but when asked, is God magical? Christians usually give two types of responses. Yes, I believe God is magic. And then they'll define what God is and define what magic is, or they'll go, no, I don't believe God is magic. But then would have to define what God is and define what magic is. On the other hand, the atheist or an atheist may say that God and magic are equally as unreal, but they would have to define what God and magic are to make that point. But even like an atheist or agnostic, when asked, is love magic or is love magical and whimsical, will likely agree that, yeah, love is kind of like what we would consider magic in a way. And this is because love, while it has some psychological and scientific components and explanations, is abstract. Matter of fact, God and magic are also abstract ideas. And these abstract ideas, like all abstract ideas, are rooted in metaphysics. Metaphysics is one of the main branches of philosophy that is concerned with the question of what is the true nature of our reality. So any question that kind of begs that question is metaphysical. So questions about heaven and hell are metaphysical, questions about love and why love exists among creatures, while it has psychological components, is metaphysical in nature because you have to define what love is, which is complicated. And magic is kind of similar in the fact that what magic is and what magic can be kind of begs the question of what is the fundamental nature of reality, and does our reality have something that can be defined as magic, or does it not have that? So if you want to know what is magic, you have to figure out what the fundamental nature of reality is, and you can't do that. I can't do that. That's almost impossible. I say almost, it arguably is fully impossible, but I don't want to go into that today. But since concepts like magic and God and love are abstract, they both are impossible to define and can be infinitely defined. They kind of exist in a metaphysical limbo where you can't prove any of them. You can't prove God, you can't prove magic, you can't prove love, but you can't disprove any of those things either. And while some people will argue some of those things have more substance than others. It's all abstract. All abstract concepts are kind of the same. Just socially we view them as different because we define them differently socially, but they're still being defined and aren't being fully proven. So I say all of this to say that this is what makes magic interesting, and this is what makes fantasy fun, to loop it back around. The metaphysical nature of fantasy worlds can be answered and defined by the author of the world, or the creator, or the story itself, because the reality of the story is being created with certain ideas in mind, unlike our reality, which we don't really know the fundamental nature. But stories, the author, or the fans, or the story itself have kind of created that fundamental nature of that reality, which is why magic is flexible and shifts from story to story. So, I say all of this to say that plant-based magical characters each have very different aspects of what they can do and what they are, but yet hold this same through line because they're all magical characters. And there holds this idea that plants can be magical and can be used for magic, and that is kind of the core idea of this video. Well, I didn't mean to fully drop metaphysical concepts and questions on you in this video. This video is not for that. You likely didn't come here to hear me haphazardly explain very complex concepts that much greater thinkers have explained much better, like David Hume and René Descartes and Saint Anselm, when it comes to defining abstract concepts and stuff. But you likely came for me to talk about people who control plants or have plant-based powers and so on and so forth. So let's talk about it. So let's start with Poison Ivy first. The infamous Batman villain. Poison Ivy is a simple character, but also not really that simple. But in simple terms, Poison Ivy is a villain of the Batman comics whose whole goal is to save the earth and the plants at the cost of humans. She usually mixes a combination of plant powers and seduction, sex appeal-ish powers to fight. Depending on the comic book run, she is a save the planet hipster at best and an eco-terrorist at worst. Either way, Poison Ivy's storylines tend to be pretty left-wing, which is why I'm a fan of Poison Ivy. But she does really value the earth and the plants and wants humans to stop destroying the earth, but she doesn't really care about humans with the exception of a few, like Harley Quinn and children. Poison Ivy, by all means, is kind of an eco-terrorist in many comics that believes humans are the root of all problems on the earth, which is interesting to me because many people in real life believe this. They're not all eco-terrorists. Poison Ivy actually tries to kill all people. But many people in real life believe that all humans are the cause of all the earth problems, which is really interesting to me because as someone who is currently pro-environment and probably will always be pro-environment, but is currently making a video about environmentalism and has made videos about environmentalism this whole month for Media Mondays, I don't believe all humans are the root of the problem. I believe the Western world, aka like Europe and America, is what's destroying the earth essentially. And before you mention how India and China have large carbon footprints, ask yourself, where do all these plastic products that they make go? Who uses them? Because they aren't using them. Half of their population can't afford half of what is made in those factories. And who's owning the factories? Those are all questions you should definitely ask yourself. But it is important to understand that Western philosophy traditionally separates civilization and humanity from nature. Western civilization presents them to be opposites. Sigmund Freud, in his work The Future of an Illusion, states this: "This psychological fact has a decisive importance for our judgment of human civilization, whereas we might at first think that its essence lies in controlling nature for the purpose of acquiring wealth, and that the dangers which threaten it could be eliminated through suitable distribution of that wealth among men." it seems that the emphasis has moved over from the material to the mentals. Freud here is using this point to talk about general Sigmund Freud nonsense, but this quote demonstrates Western thinking as a whole. Freud clearly believes that society at first exists to dominate nature and to get resources before shifting over to a society that's about dominating each other. That's why he says it shifts from resources, aka materials, to mentals. This is a common idea in the West, that civilization exists outside of nature and that civilization must dominate nature, which is why we build houses the way we build houses. You know, Western civilization kind of looks down on people who build their houses out of clay or mud or things that are really more considered of the earth, and sees those people as barbaric because they make their houses out of like mud and clay instead of bricks and plastic and sheetrock. Yet these civilizations and these people tend to believe that they live alongside nature and that their houses should also live alongside nature. In the West, we build cities apart from nature, on top of nature, not in nature. At least that's how we think of it, which is why they flood badly. If you build a city with nature in mind, you can actually prevent a lot of flooding, believe it or not. But we don't really do that. Also, sometimes cities and whole buildings sink because we don't pay attention to where we build things and how we build things and what type of things we build on what type of land. So, you know, it's weird to think that civilizations exist apart from land and apart from nature. Civilizations exist in nature. That's kind of what most non-Western philosophy holds. So Poison Ivy as a character kind of is weird to me in many regards, as she's a character who wants to destroy human life because of its effects on the earth, and she should probably rethink some of that. She might want to realize that a very specific train of thought leads to the destruction of the earth, not all people. And if you believe that all people lead to the destruction of the earth, you may also want to rethink a lot of that, because I can guarantee you, if everyone lived in what you consider a mud hut, the earth would be in a little bit of a better place, because you're living in something that is made of the earth and also made to work with the earth. Anyway, Poison Ivy's character kind of has some key attributes, right? A deep belief in love of nature and that and all that is natural, a belief that humans do not understand nature and the natural, and the desire to save the nature in the natural. Those are the three attributes of Poison Ivy's character. These three attributes I would like to contribute to myself in many ways, although I'm not the most pro-ecological figure. I eat meat despite its harmful environmental impacts and capitalistic impacts. You know, I consume a lot of plastic products due to my economic standing. I can only afford so much. But I do view the key aspects of Poison Ivy's characters to be good attributes. She's just presented as a villain, and the question is why. You know, Poison Ivy, granted, does take these three ideas to their extreme, and they're extreme in a very specific direction, to be fair. But Poison Ivy is presented this way in an extreme version of this ideology is interesting to me. Poison Ivy doesn't even really fully take these attributes to the extreme in a way that makes sense to me. She takes them in a way that doesn't make sense, because her disregard for humans is proof of Western thinking, that humans exist apart from nature, humans exist to dominate nature. Non-Western philosophers will always point to the fact that humans are natural, therefore humans are a part of nature, therefore anything that is human-made is natural. That's what non-Western thinking tends to do. There's no such thing as man-made versus natural. It's all the same. How can man make something apart from nature? You know, is kind of how non-Western philosophy kind of thinks. So it's interesting and important to understand Poison Ivy's three key attributes and how she holds that human beings are separate from nature, and what that kind of reveals about Western thinking. Okay, now that we got the biggest plant-based character out of the way, I want to quickly move through the other characters if I can. The next character I want to mention is also a DC Comics character, and that is Swamp Thing. Swamp Thing is a person made out of plants. He was a human who was living and conducting dangerous experiments in a lab in a swamp until something in his lab exploded and he died. Yet he was chosen by a force called the Green, which is an underlying, undying elemental force that connects all plants on the planet, according to DC Comics. So now Swamp Thing is connected to all the plants on the planet, using a power called the Green. Now, technically, Poison Ivy also harnesses the power of the Green, but unlike Swamp Thing, she's not the Green's protector. Swamp Thing's the Green's protector. It's also ambiguous whether Poison Ivy actually knows that she harnesses the power of the Green in most comics. But anyway, the Green's protector, which is Swamp Thing, is chosen by an immortal group of trees called the Parliament of Trees, which watch over the Green. Yes, this is how his storylines work out. Swamp Thing's really interesting, but also really funny in retrospect. Like, what do you mean you were chosen by a group of immortal ancient trees to protect all plants? That's so funny. At least to me, it's funny to me. But this is only kind of some of the case, actually. So in the New Earth run of the comics, which is a super old run, it's revealed that Swamp Thing is actually a plant that saw the human die and then took on his identity and took all his memories. Therefore, Swamp Thing has the memories of this human who died, but he's not that human. He is a plant, which is strange and kind of creates this reality in which Swamp Thing's storyline creates a core question. What's the difference between a person and a plant? And before you state the usual answers like blood, skin, flesh, a mouth, the question is more about the nature of existing, or the nature of being, which is ontology, another branch of philosophy, the study of being. But anyway, the question is, if a plant becomes conscious and has the memories of a human, is it not a person? You know, sure, it's a plant, sure, it's not a Homo sapien, it's not a human, but it is a person, it has personhood, because it has consciousness. It has autonomy. So, Swamp Thing's major attributes are a little different than Poison Ivy's. He has two, opposed to Poison Ivy's three. Swamp Thing's two major attributes are: is there a line between humans and other living things? And if so, it's likely blurry. And the second major attribute of his storyline is there is a force that connects all plants, and one must tap into that force to save nature. These attributes are similar to Poison Ivy in the fact that there is some overlap. A Swamp Thing, like Poison Ivy, desires to defend nature, has a deep love of nature. He doesn't do the whole humans don't fully understand nature, usually, because Swamp Thing assumes that he was human. But Swamp Thing's storyline really centers the two attributes I just mentioned, while Poison Ivy's attributes kind of also hold these two, but they play out in the background of Poison Ivy's character. Like, she uses the Green, but she's somewhat unaware of that fact. So she can tap into this connective force that connects all plants, but she doesn't know that's what she's doing. And she also kind of embodies the idea that there's a blurry line between humans and other living beings, and the fact that Poison Ivy is both human but also kind of a plant in and of herself, like, because of her backstory changes from time to time to time, but ultimately she's a mixture of a human and a plant. So, blurry line. Swamp Thing also, in comparison though, is different than Poison Ivy, because Swamp Thing is a plant with the memories of a human that thinks they're a human, while Poison Ivy is a human who somehow gained the attributes of a plant. They kind of like flip each other's like attributes, which is why the attributes of Poison Ivy are background attributes for Swamp Thing, and the main attributes of Swamp Thing are background attributes of Poison Ivy. It's kind of complicated like that, but it kind of demonstrates the same point. In the show Adventure Time, the main character Finn goes through a complex storyline involving a grass sword, which is what it sounds like. It's a sword made of grass. The grass sword is cursed and parasitic in the sense that Finn can never get rid of it, and it slowly tries to take him over. Finn goes through several trials and adventures with this grass sword, and the grass sword's helpful because it is a sword. But there's one time where Finn's trying to get to his father. His father's kind of a chaotic neutral character who's trying to escape to another world. Finn's trying to get to his father, so his grass sword fuses with his arm into like a mangle of vines, and Finn tries to reach out for this type of spaceship that his father's on, but it's too far away, and the arm stretches and breaks off, like vines and plants tend to do if stretched too much. And in its place is a singular flower. This flower is on Finn's arm. It replaces his arm for a decent amount of episodes. Later, the arm grows back. Kind of complicated storyline there, in the sense that the flower grows and just recreates an arm. But during this time, Finn gets another sword, a version of himself in a way. It's called the Finn sword. Long, complicated adventure. Finn discovers a sword that is just him in sword form. It's literally a version of his soul. And there's some kooky magic involved. Adventure Time, again, crazy story. But at some point, Finn has to defeat another person wielding the Finn sword with the grass sword, and he breaks the Finn sword, and the two swords start to fuse, essentially. And since the Finn sword has Finn's soul in it, and the grass sword is a parasitic cursed sword, as the two swords fuse, they kind of create chaos. Eventually, Fern kind of forms out of the union of these two swords, which is a version of Finn that's made out of grass, essentially. It's implied that the soul of the Finn sword fused with the evil, parasitic nature of the grass sword and created this new version of Finn. Fern has all of Finn's current memories at the time that Fern was made, and Fern believes himself to be Finn because he has all his memories. He has his consciousness. He has a version of his soul. But from this point on, Fern becomes a different character than Finn, because Finn is Finn, and Fern may have Finn's memories, but Fern is not Finn. I'm saying Finn a lot. It's kind of weird. This leads to a complex storyline in which Fern feels stuck in Finn's shadow. Fern tries to kill Finn. Fern dies. Fern comes back to life, and Fern dies again. But the second time Fern dies is at the end of this first show. There's now a second show, apparently. But at the end of the first show, where they're fighting what is essentially a god of chaos, Fern dies while helping in that fight, and just asks for Finn and Finn's adoptive brother Jake, who is a dog. Complex show. Strange show. Fern asks Finn and Jake to plant him at the treehouse. Finn and Jake live in a treehouse. Unbeknownst to Fern, the treehouse was destroyed. So they just plant Fern where the treehouse used to be, and Fern grows into a huge tree over the course of arguably, I think it's over 100 years or so, into a huge tree that breaks through the clouds. Fern's story, and to a great extent Finn's story, is a complex arc about what it means to be a person. Finn is called Finn the Human throughout the show. He's the only human that we know of for a majority of the show. The rest of the humans are believed to have died out or been wiped out. So being a human is core to Finn's identity, but throughout the show, Finn slowly realizes that being a human is important, I guess, for his lineage, but he's also a person, and everyone else are also people, even though they're not humans. They're still conscious beings. Fern, on the other hand, has Finn's memories. Fern has the memories of being Finn the human, but Fern is not a human. He's a plant. And because of that, Fern has to learn how to become his own being, even though him and Finn share two versions of the same soul, and is very interconnected. Fern is not Finn, and he can never be Finn again, essentially. If you can't tell, Fern and Finn's storyline is similar to Swamp Thing's, in the sense that it holds a core theme of what does it mean to be alive, what does it mean to be a person, what is the difference between a plant and a person. There's an interconnected nature between Finn and Fern, just like the Green and Swamp Thing story demonstrates an interconnected nature between all plants. Similar to Swamp Thing's story, there is also this just general belief in interconnectedness, a underlying concept between all plants and all people in a way. These first three characters that I've covered kind of show that magic, in the context of plant-based magical characters, tends to bring up the question of what is humans' relationship to nature? What is a person? What is a person's relationship to nature? What does it mean to be a person? So the last character I want to discuss is Green Bull from the anime One Piece. Green Bull is a hard character to explain if you've never seen One Piece, because most things in One Piece are hard to explain if you've never seen it, and it's super long, so a lot of people have not seen it. But the short of it is, he's a character that fights on behalf of an evil world government, and he's one of the strongest characters on the side of the world government. And he believes that the rulers of the world government are gods, and that society is inherently hierarchical and must be to be just and to enact justice. Green Bull argues that there are supposed to be people at the bottom of the hierarchy and people on the top, and the people on the top are supposed to decide justice. That is reality. And that even if the people on top decide that racism, genocide, and more are in the name of justice, therefore they must be justice, according to Green Bull. But what's interesting is Green Bull uses plant-based powers as his main source of power. He can also use his plants to suck the energy out of enemies. But it's also interesting that wherever he walks, plants grow underneath his feet, like a lot of plants. He can basically restore whole ecosystems by being in it. He first appears in the One Piece story arc Wano. Wano is a country completely destroyed by industrialization and imperialism, and most of the land has lost its plant life. But when Green Bull comes, he restores a lot of the greenery on the island just by being there and walking around. But it's not his intent to restore the greenery, it's his intent to destroy what he considers the enemies of the world government in favor of his strange ideology. I can't really explain any more of Green Bull's ideology in this video. That's for a future video about the philosophy of justice and so on and so forth. But the main thing I want to point out is that Green Bull's ability contrasts his views. His ability to like restore land and to like use plants is like kind of beautiful in a way, where Wano, this land that was destroyed by industrialism and factories, is being restored by this man's powers. But his ideology is awful. He essentially came there to kill all the people. He doesn't really care about the land. He doesn't, and not in the Poison Ivy way, where Poison Ivy wants to save the planet. Green Bull just literally does not care about these people and views them all as enemies of the world government. So essentially, there's this other underlying thing about plant-based characters, and it's something I didn't really mention what Poison Ivy and Swamp Thing is. Poison Ivy is considered a beautiful character, both inside the comic books, like the people in the comic books consider Poison Ivy to be pretty, but also comic book fans believe Poison Ivy to be really pretty. Swamp Thing kind of has the opposite problem, where Swamp Thing is represented in the story to be extremely ugly, and most of the fans also think he's kind of ugly. It kind of shows this duality of plants, where Poison Ivy is associated with like the pretty flowers and stuff, and Swamp Thing is associated with like moss and like vines, things people don't typically find attractive. And there's a whole thing I can go into of how like the less attractive or beautiful we think a thing is, the more likely we are to not care about that thing, and so on and so forth. But Green Bull kind of exists in the duality of the beauty and ugliness of plants, but in a different way, where his powers are extremely beautiful. They're the beauty of plants, but his ideology is awful and results in awful, awful things, which ultimately shows that plant-based powers and characters seem to demonstrate how humans decide value. Poison Ivy is beautiful while Swamp Thing is ugly. There's some level of value in how we're perceiving these characters. This is related to a branch of philosophy called Axiology. I'm mentioning all the branches of philosophy today. Axiology centers the question, what is valuable, or the question, what is the inherent value of things? Aesthetics is one of the sub-branches of axiology. Aesthetics is what it sounds like. It centers the question, what is beautiful? Another sub-branch of axiology is ethics. Ethics is the question of what is good and what is justice. Green Bull's story kind of reflects both of that. His powers are pretty, but his soul isn't pretty. That both of those are questions of beauty. Beauty isn't just how something looks. When people say, that's a beautiful action, like when a firefighter saves a baby, that's also a value judgment. Green Bull's soul is not beautiful, but his powers are. Green Bull thinks he's acting in the name of justice, but most of us wouldn't think he's acting in the name of justice. That's a value judgment. That's ethics. So many other characters kind of point at this too, as with Green Bull, Poison Ivy is also a villain and brings up questions of ethics. What is just? Well, Swamp Thing and Poison Ivy kind of bring up the question of aesthetics. What is beautiful? So obviously this is not the most in-depth I can go with this analysis, but I want to highlight the start of this conversation, essentially, where plant-based magic in stories is an attempt by the author to usually try to better understand the reality of nature, plants, and humans, as well as the connecting factor between nature, plants, and humans, essentially. And to understand the relationship between humans and nature, one must understand the nature of souls or memories. Philosopher Samuel Taylor Coleridge once said, "The love of nature is ever returned doubled to us, not only as the delighter in our delight, but by linking our sweetest, but of themselves perishable feelings to distinct vivid images, which we ourselves at times, and which 1,000 recollections recall our memories." What Coleridge is saying here is that nature can give us words and feelings through images, and while that may not seem like it makes much sense, when you spend a lot of time in nature, you gain a lot of memories of sighting rare birds, insects, animals, strange plants. You have memories of beautiful sights, and so on and so forth. And while you're not able to understand how you feel about these birds, plants, animals, and sights in the moment, years later when you remember them, you kind of start to understand your feelings about them because you've experienced more. You've experienced more nature, you've experienced more reality. And these memories allow you to slightly peer behind the curtain of what reality is. For a glimpse, you can kind of see the fundamental true nature of reality, even if you can't really explain it or answer it. You see, in this sense, fantasy has so many questions and answers when it comes to the nature of reality. And plant-based magic users and characters are so interesting because nature, like magic, is abstract. It is complicated. It is hard to explain. And it can only be answered if you understand reality in its fullest. Nature is connected to the fundamental nature of reality and the existence of what is real. So, nature tells us a lot about the world we live in, but it's hard to understand nature in the world we live in. And in that sense, nature truly is magical. So, thank you for watching this video. Sorry I haven't uploaded as much as I would like to this month. I've had some crazy personal stuff to really happen to me this month. And they will make for stories for a later time. But I wanted to finish out this Media's Mondays theme of July, which is environmentalism, ecology, eco-criticism, with, you know, something really fantasy adjacent, really fantasy involved, really not adjacent. And that's why I talked about this today. I didn't mean for it again to talk about metaphysics and so much philosophy as much as it did, but I was just reflecting on my thoughts about these characters and what they can tell us, and so on and so forth. So I hope you enjoyed it as my, I think, third YouTube video ever. Anyway, I'm saying this to say Philosophy Fridays are coming. Again, my life has been crazy hectic, but I do want to talk about just philosophy for some videos, and hopefully there'll be a Philosophy Friday video out this Friday on something fairly interesting. But next month's theme, August, is something I'm still tweaking. I know I need to release a video by Monday, but there's a few different directions I can go, and I'm trying to figure out the best thing that kind of is in line with generally how people feel about August. I did environmentalism in July because it's so hot outside that obviously, like, the climate is changing, and I felt like nobody ever wants to talk about that and why it's so hot. So I was like, I'll just talk about environmentalism. But there's tons of ways I can go with Medium Mondays, and I'm very excited to explore new ways. And if you have ideas, drop them in the comments and let me know your thoughts on the video. This video is a little rushed. I won't say too rushed because I'm not like an amateur, but with so much going on in my personal life, I wanted to put this video out there before July was over because it's something I wanted to talk about, but there's definitely elements of the video I could have expounded upon more and so on and so forth, but this is probably not the end of this conversation, and there's many ideas I planted in myself in this video that I want to look into, but all that's to say, I hope you enjoy, and thank you so much for watching this video, and please give feedback, constructive. I can only handle so much like negative comments right now in my life, but thank you again.